Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. In this video, I'm going to be finishing up Citadel's Xv95 Ghostkeel Battlesuit. It's part of the Warhammer 40K universe. And sometimes I weather models, because that's what I'm going to do in this video. It's going to be all the weathering. Sometimes I weather models apart and find it easier to do that. But on this one, I think I'm going to do it all together. Just to keep it as one unit and do it that way, get in a little practice doing that. I'm always a big proponent of changing up what you're doing so that you don't get in a rut of doing everything the same way every time. So I'm going to be doing that. It's not a huge difference. It's not going to be difficult to get to anything, but I'm going to be assembling this and get to the weathering. Another thing I'm going to be doing in this video is doing the bases for both the model and the two little drones that come with it. And I'm no great base maker, so I'm not going to hold out what I do as, hey, this is the end-all be-all of bases. It's just going to be a simple base with some texture on it, maybe a few rocks, a few grass tufts, and leave it at that. But hopefully it'll look pretty cool. So I'll be doing that also in this video. All right, for the base, like I said, I want to just have a little bit of texture on it, maybe some grass tufts. It's going to be kind of a desert base because that's just the easiest to do. I grabbed some little rocks from my backyard. I think these are actually pieces of chunks of concrete from when they were doing an addition to our house a few years ago. I like these because they've got some texture to them, and when you paint over it, it just looks a little more rocky to me than just some kind of smooth rock. It just that texture I like. But I've just picked up a few of them, washed them off, and what I did was I glued the feet on to the legs. And all I want to do is just kind of see where I want to position the model and where I want to position the rocks. So I think I'm going to have him at an angle about like that. So I think I'm going to put this big rock kind of towards the front here, and maybe this little one next to it, like that. And then I'll just put this one maybe back over here, like that. But that way I can make sure that I don't have any problems with getting the model onto the base after I've got everything glued on. To glue them on, all I use is CA glue. I'm using Gorilla Glue here, but anything that's CA glue will work. And I just put I'm not dainty with it, I just put a big old blob right on there because I want to make sure this puppy stays in place like that. And I also want to make sure there's enough on there that will make contact. And I just kind of put it on there and position it where I want. Now you can, of course, put any kind of stuff on here. You could put, if you wanted more of a woodland scene, you could put various sticks and twigs and either just stuff out of the yard or stuff that's commercially produced. You could use various, whenever I'm finished with my glue, tap it 3 times and knock it out of the neck, and then do that. It won't dry up on you. Anyway, you can put whatever you want here. Because I'm keeping it simple, I'm just going to go with these rocks. But I've actually used various putties and things like that to maybe give it some more relief, some texture, make a little rise on it. So a base, you can do whatever you want. And if you don't want to do a base, I've used bases from a company called Elric's Hobbies. They do some really, really fantastic bases. So if you're into Warhammer 40K and you want, like a really showpiece looking base, check their stuff out. But I'm going to give this time to dry, and then I'll get on to the next steps. I primed the base in Badger Stynylrez Black Primer, and then I wanted to give it a coating of texture, and this European thick mud from Vallejo is just an absolutely perfect product for this. It's a very thick paste with some kind of fibrous, gritty material in it. I'm not sure that it's not maybe just mud they dig up behind the Vallejo factory. I don't know exactly what's in it, but it works really well. And you can see I'm just using an old nylon brush to apply a great big old blob of this stuff. You can put it on thick, you can put it on in a blob and then spread it out, which is what I'm going to do. But once I get that initial amount on there, I just start dipping into my cup of water and spreading that around. And you can see I'm working it off the brush. And this is all the material I added. That initial blob that you saw is all I put on, and I just kept spreading it around and spreading it around. And I was looking for, as I've mentioned many times, that TLAR point. That looks about right. I didn't want it to be huge, thick, but I wanted it to be thick enough to look like a textured bunch of ground. And so once I got it spread out, I just began using more water to move it around, to manipulate it, to just get it in place. And then finally I just doused it with water, again smoothing it out, working out the brush marks, and just trying to leave it looking like some muddy ground. And then I could just set it aside to dry overnight and come back the next day and continue working on it. Alright, that's dried overnight and it's pretty solid. This stuff, it while it's dry, it's flexible. So if you have any areas that are a little sharper, I guess you'd say, than you want, you can just take your finger or your fingernail and just kind of flatten them down. I've even sanded this stuff. You have to do it lightly, but you can sand stuff away. You can push it down. You can roll it down. There's a lot of things you can do with it. But you see, it just gives it a textury surface. Now, there are a few areas here that the texture underneath is still showing. It doesn't look, I don't think it would look bad under paint, but it's a little more of the texture than I want to show. So I'm going to add a little bit more on here, and then I think that'll get the base covered nicely. And then I'm going to do one more step to add hopefully a nice little realistic touch to it. And what I'm going to do now is I want to make some kind of footprint looking things. So I want to see about where he's going to be stepping. So right under here, and I'm going to put a bigger blob there. And then where the other foot will go, I'll put another blob. All right, and then I'm just going to take his feet and push down in there like that. Then I'm going to get my brush and I'm going to dip it in some water, and I'm just going to blend out some of this excess so there's not a huge amount. What I want is, I don't want it to just look like it's just set on top. I want to have a little bit of an impression or something that makes it look like it's in there. Now, when I finally get the whole thing done, I may go back in with some other weathering stuff and glue him to the base and actually put a little more in there. But this way, if it will stay, it gives me just a nice little place to stick him after it's done, and it'll look like it's part of the whole thing. And I'll just go and lightly clean that stuff up. I may leave it, who knows. But that way you've got a little place where he's going to be, and it looks like the weight of his suit, the weight of his suit. This is just falling apart, ain't it? I need to just stop. The weight of his suit is pushing down into the dirt. Yeah, we're going to go fix this now. Just cut to the next thing, John. There you go. I started off painting the base with this Iraqi sand color. I just thought it gives it a good sand color. And I just thinned it down and went in with a fairly large brush and kind of slopped it on. I knew it would take 2 or 3 coats to get up to full opacity, so I didn't try to be neat about it. I just kept putting it on. It ended up taking 2 layers for most of it. A few places where it was a little thin, I had to go in with 3 layers. But I thought it looked pretty good, and it sells the notion of sand. for the rocks, I wanted to base them in sky gray. I'd seen a picture of the American Southwest and saw some rocks that stood out from the sand. They were kind of a rust color, but I thought I wanted to start with this base of gray. And then I went in to dry brush that with Doom Bull Brown to begin the rust. And as I began to dry brush this, I started wondering, why didn't I do this before I painted the sand? And then the more I thought about it, it kind of dawned on me why I didn't do that.
Because I have this unique way of finding ways to make things harder.
Yeah, so I got that going for me, which is nice. But the Tuscarora Fur was the next color that I put on, and I did this on the top. I thought that what this would do was kind of lighten it up to make it look more sun-faded. But as it turned out, when I went to the next step, which was putting Agrax Earthshade over it to darken it down a bit, it covered up all of that and just kind of blended it all into one tone. But I was okay with it. I thought it looked okay. And if in the process, if I decide I want to go back and change it, I can always add more dry brushing over it. And then I went back to clean up my previous mistakes with the Iraqi sand, and again, just put those on in 2 or 3 coats to cover up that errant dry brushing that I made for myself there, and just cleaned it up, gave it another coat around to make sure everything looked good. And then I wanted to add some grass tufts. So I've had these sitting around forever. They're from Citadel, and they're just a little sheet of tribbles, I guess you would say, just little grass tufts with, they have a slightly adhesive backing, but it didn't seem like it was enough to really hold them down. So I put some PVA glue, some white glue on the back of it, and just kind of tucked them into the area around the rocks. My thinking was I wanted to do it on one side, that would be the side away from the wind to indicate that, that's where they grew. And I thought it looked pretty good. I still need to do some things to tone down the color, but I liked the way that made the base look. And I'm going to grab a little more of that Iraqi sand color, and I'm just going to run it over this grass to take away some of that green and just make it look like it's, that growth in the desert that sometimes happens where it'll get a little rain and then stuff will grow and it'll be there for a few days and then dies again. That's what I'm kind of pretending this is. So hopefully that will convey this. And if you're wondering why I did it on one side of the rock and not the other, my thinking is that there's always high winds. When I've been in desert areas, there's always been a lot of wind. And my thinking is that the high winds and the constant dirt being blasted would keep it from growing on this side. So I'm thinking the wind comes from that direction. I have no idea if that's actually true or not, but it sounds impressive. So anyway, that's my thinking here. So I'm going to finish up dry brushing this grass a little bit and making it look less green, and then move on with weathering the Ghostkeel itself. Alright, first step in the weathering is I'm going to get this guy assembled. Alright, I got it at this stage. I think I'm going to leave it here for some of the initial weathering, the chipping and some of the things like that, just to make handling it a little easier. One thing I did want to note on the shoulder armor, there's not some great attachment points. There's just basically 2 little flat spaces that attach to the back of it. All I did there was scrape the paint off of the shoulder surface. I hadn't painted the back of the armor, and I put some Tamiya extra thin cement on this, the other side of this, on the flat side that the armor was supposed to glue onto. I put a pretty good amount on it, and then I just pushed the armor down onto it for just a second and then pulled it back off, and that let me see where the contact was being made, because it left some glue on the inside of this armor, and I added some extra Tamiya extra thin cement there and then pushed the 2 together really hard. And what that did, or what I'm hoping it did, is that it really melted that plastic and bonded the two together, and it'll make a real good strong bond. That's what I've done in the past, and it's always worked well. The main thing you have to remember is to scrape any paint or primer off of the mating surfaces, and you'll get the best bond, I think, that you can get with that. And I like doing it better than super glue. While super glue will hold it well, super glue doesn't melt the plastic. And if it gets a real strong shock, super glue is really strong if you try to pull it apart, but it's not quite as strong necessarily with sheer force going up or down. So I think the Tamiya Extra Thin or any welding cement works a little better, but that's what I did there. For the chipping, I've decided to try and go a little less heavy than I normally do, so I'm not going to do any sponge chipping. Sponge chipping looks great. I like doing it. It's a very fast way of doing it, but it tends to, and when I do it, maybe you don't have this problem, but I tend to over chip when I do sponge chipping, and I don't want this thing to appear to be too heavily chipped. I want to rely more on streaks and stains to convey use. But the theory, I guess you'd say, of my chipping is that this black material is the color of whatever that material is, whatever space composite it is. So there's not going to be any chipping on the black areas. The white areas, I'm going to use German gray, primarily for the contrast. I mean, in my thinking is that, that it's maybe the same composite material or a similar material. So the German gray is what I'm going to use for the white, but like I said, primarily as a contrast choice. And then on these neutral gray areas, I'm going to go with sky gray, again for contrast. But in my thinking, the white is painted over a darker composite, and then the gray is painted over the white. Now, my plan at this point is not to do any two-color chipping. Sometimes I like that, sometimes I don't. I think if it's not done well, it looks a bit cartoony, and quite frankly, I've seen a lot of people who do it really well, and I'm not really a fan of my own two-color chipping in a lot of cases. I think it works in some of the things I've done, and some of them I got done with it, and I thought, I probably shouldn't have done that. So I'm not going to do any two-color chipping as I'm thinking right now. Now, if later on in the video I say, hey, I changed my mind, well, that can happen. Anyway, let me get all the paint set up, and I'll start doing paint chipping. All right, I've got my German gray loaded up in the palette. I thinned it. The best way I can describe it is I thinned it to the point that it flows off the brush easily, but when it gets to the model, it sticks in place. It's kind of a Goldilocks thinning. It's not too thin, it's not too thick, it's just right. If you're doing brush chipping, I would say start off with your paint thicker and then work for that point, adjust it as needed where, like I said, where it flows off the brush easily. You don't have any flow problems, but you don't want to be doing chips and let's say, chip along a detail or something and all of a sudden the paint just goes flowing off. You don't want that. So it may take a little experimentation, but it's fairly forgiving, especially using acrylics like this. Now I'm using my Wargamer character brush. I like this brush because it has a very nice point, but the brush is large enough that it actually holds some paint. So I like using this, and what I do is I just dip that into my paint, and I start by touching it onto a paper towel so that I don't have too much. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look for some areas initially that I want to develop some chips in along edges and places like that, because chipping can do several things for you. Chipping can, obviously its primary purpose is to convey that there's damage to whatever it is you're modeling, but it also serves as a bit of an edge highlight, and it can define edges and draw attention to areas that the eye may not otherwise pay a lot of attention to. So now on this model, because it's black and white and there's such stark contrast on areas, it's not as necessary. But quite often, if let's say you've got something that has maybe 2 shades of blue on it, and they're different, but they're not, there's not a huge amount of contrast between them. Using chipping will help define the separation between the parts and help give it more distinctiveness. But as you see, I'm just being very careful about where I'm putting the chips and putting them on very lightly. Right now I'm going more for the streaks in the larger chips, and then I'll go back later and do what, I guess if I remember my 7th grade art class, would be pointillism, which is just every here and there putting in dots like that to represent tiny scuffs. I should point out, I've heard Lincoln Wright say this quite often, you have to be careful when you're doing brush chipping to not just do loads and loads of little lines of dots, because as he says, it starts looking like a line of ants across your model. And I agree with that, and I will admit that I've been guilty of that a few times. But these are just kind of painted on like this, and you'll notice that my grip is much closer to the brush when I'm doing this type. Now, if I want to do some chipping and actually take advantage of the shakiness of my hands where it's a little more wobbly, I'll actually hold the brush further back, this far back. And then, now this will be difficult to do around the camera, as I'm fond of complaining about, but I'll just let my hand kind of bounce along like that and introduce a chip like that. So that's what I'm going to be doing around the rest of the model and getting the chipping in. And right here, this is kind of the area that I'm going to look at to say, okay, this is the level of chipping I want. I don't want to exceed this level of chipping anywhere on the model. So I'm really trying to show some restraint on this. So let me get to work on this and continue on with the build of this really cool looking kit. All right, I want to start the process of adding some stains to the model, and just various places that represent, anything from fluid leaks to, things spilling on it externally, and just whatever, but various fluid leaks. And you can use acrylics, oils, enamels, whatever you want to do. What I like to do is use any acrylic products first in the weathering, whether it's for chipping, for stains, for leaks, for earth effects. Generally, I want to try and do all of the acrylic products first, and do it as completely as possible with acrylics. This way, when I go back and use oils or enamels, and I primarily use oils, to enhance those effects, to add to them, to get the benefits of those, they're the last things I put on the model. I can then finish up the model, set it aside for maybe 24 hours to dry, and then matte coat it if I need to, because the oils will have dried enough by then that I can put a matte coat on it and everything will be fine. But I won't have to, because they're the last thing to go on, I won't have to worry about them interfering with any other weathering applications or with each other, and can just count the thing done. So to start off, I'm going to be using 2 things for streaking and staining of fluids. I'm going to be using oil stains and petrol spills from Vallejo. This is part of their Mecha weathering line. Now this is the same stuff that is in their larger weathering line bottle, just their standard stuff. It's the same stuff. I just use this because it's in a dropper bottle. It's easier to get out. And what these basically are, if you really want to get down to it, it's gloss Agrax Earthshade and gloss Known Oil in terms of color. This is a brownish color. This is a black color. That's what I'm really going for. I don't care whether it's oil or petrol. I just want some brown and some black. All right, what I've got in my palette are basically the black color, the brown color, and then 2 palette wells with airbrush thinner, Vallejo airbrush thinner. And I could have used water for this. I just had the airbrush thinner handy. And then I've got a paper towel, of course, if I need to dab things off. But whenever you're working with acrylics, remember that it's an additive process. It's not like oils where you put it on and then take it off. With acrylics, you put it on lightly and then build it up. Now, one of the places I'm going to use as an example is I'm imagining this to be some kind of vent for some mechanical thing inside the armor. So I want some staining around this, and I'm just going to use the brown for the reasons. Now initially I'm going to go in with a little more of the color because I want the outline to be fairly distinct with this weathering stain stuff. But I'll just put that on reasonably heavy, not slopping it on there, but just to give it a look like, okay, there's something going on there. There's something that's dirty about this. Now, I may follow this up later with some kind of soot staining or something like that. Remember, weathering is not a single step. Weathering is layering things up. Weathering, the more weathering steps you put on top of each other, I think the more realistic it looks, the more plausible it looks, because it happens over time, and it continually happens. Now I'm going to go and along the bottom of it, again going with the idea that this is a fluid stain, I'm going to put some along the bottom here, and I'm going to take it, if it goes all the way to that panel line, I'm okay with that. Now you'll notice it pulls back up into the recesses, but I'm actually putting it right down to the panel line, because I'm imagining as stuff flows down, it'll get down to that panel line and discolor it just a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to dip it in this thinner, and then I'm going to just apply some of the thinner here down from that. Wipe that off, and then just touch into that and let that flow a little bit. Now, pre-wetting it like that will lighten up the application that I put on there. It won't be as heavy, and the wash, this brown fluid, will work its way through that thinner that I put there on the surface and produce a fairly realistic leak look, because it's flowing through that liquid. And you'll notice it collects down here, and if I want to, I can go in and touch into the thinner and just put some more thinner and let that draw down in there. So you can kind of trace your stain in thinner. See how that did right there? That's exactly what I wanted it to do. And then just let it flow. And if I think it's too much, I can go in while it's still wet and just lighten that up. And it leaves a pretty nice, I think, a pretty nice stain. So I'm going to continue doing that process at various places around the model. And what I'll do is, once these dry, I'll go back and reevaluate them. I may add a heavier application in some areas, or in other cases, I may go and add another color around it or on top of it or through the middle of it to just sell the notion that, hey, something here is leaking. If you're wanting to get a really just kind of subtle streak on something, either originating from a small point or as if it's just coming from one corner or one edge of something, you get your brush to a really sharp point. I lick it to do that, and get just a little bit of your color on it. And then you start, and instead of pulling from the source down, you pull from the termination point back, like that. That was a little too subtle, wasn't it? But the reason you do it backwards is it's going to deposit more color at the end of the brush stroke than at the beginning, and that's the way you want a leak to look. You want it to be heavier at the beginning, the point of origination. Shouldn't be drinking this early in the morning, John. Rather than at the end of it. And so by doing it this way, starting here and pulling back, I make sure that happens. And now when I look at that, that's a nice little just subtle streak there. And people will say, you can't do that with acrylics. Yeah, you can. You just have to use a slightly different technique to apply it. All right, with the various fluid stains mostly behind me, the acrylic ones, I'm going to go in and add some dust effects to the feet. I don't want to take it too high up on the model, but I want to indicate that there is some dust going on. So what I'm going to use for this as a base is this Vallejo Desert Dust Model Wash. Now this stuff, I use it quite a lot, and I like these Vallejo washes. One thing you do have to be careful of is you have to stir them frequently because the pigment in them will settle out quite fast. But what I'm going to do is just kind of go in and begin just dotting this on like that. Because the base is a light tan color, I want a dusting of just a light color to suggest that dust. Now this goes on much more opaque than it will dry. So if you've never used them and you first put it on and you think, oh man, I've made a mistake, give it a little while. Once it dries, it'll be a fairly thin, fairly transparent layer, and you can either layer up more on top of it or go in with different colors. One of the things I like to do if I'm using a darker, suggesting it's operating in darker mud environment or earth environment, is I'll put on the lighter color and go higher up on whatever I'm doing, and then put some darker washes further down, and just suggest that there's dust that has dried up, and then there's dirt lower down. Because if you've ever noticed, most of the time when dirt dries, it's lighter than when it's wet. So having those dust effects higher up, I think just kind of sells the notion of what's happening there. But I'm just going to apply some of this on, and you can see over here where it's drying. You see how transparent it is. So I'm just going to keep building this up. I may add a touch of a darker color into this. I may just touch some of this over into there, just to give me a little bit of variety. But I just want this to appear dusty. You can also add pigments into this, which will change the color. And if you put a lot of pigment and just a little bit of this in, you get some texture. And this also acts as a fixer. So this model wash is some, in my opinion, some really useful stuff. I've been experimenting with Citadel contrast paints. If you're not familiar with contrast paints, they're basically I don't want to call it a thinned paint. They have some body to them, but they're designed to allow whatever they're painted over to somewhat shine through. The idea being in the game that, let's say you prime a Space Marine figure, for instance, with a light gray color, that when you paint this over it, it will settle into the recesses and make those darker. It will tint the flat surfaces, but it won't cling to the edges and creates a bit of an edge highlight. It's meant to be just a fast way to get your armies painted. But I've been seeing a lot of people use these to good effect in a lot of ways, and so I thought, why not use this new bottle of turquoise? It's called Pterodon Turquoise, to just paint these lenses here. So if I can just go in and get that on there. What I did was I painted the main part of the lens with sky gray, and then right in the center of it I put a white dot. Now my hope is that will shine through and give it a bit of a glowy effect. We shall see, because honestly this is only the second or third time I've used these contrast paints like this. But we'll let that dry and see how it looks, but I like that. I like that a lot. I may go back in and put another white dot over it and then go back over it and see how that looks. But I'm going to give this a chance to dry, and then I may try putting thinning it out a little and putting it around it to just make it appear as if there's a little bit of a glow. But I'm not sure if I'm going to do that, so I'm going to think about it a while. All right, I think I have all the acrylic weathering that I want done, completed at this point. You can see that it's just like here along these vents along the legs. I just gave it a little bit of staining there. And of course, as I'd shown around that vent and over here. Now, the finish is glossy. Everything else that I've done has been matte. I haven't decided yet if I want to leave that glossy or if I'm going to matte that down later. I'm going to just keep looking at it and see how it grows on me. One of the things that I want to point out, notice the stains right below here and right below here. This is why I like using acrylics for some stains, because you see how they left a very definite outline, what many people would call tide marks. But I think when you're trying to go for certain types of oily stains, that's a good thing. That putting on oils, yes, you could do that, but it would, if you put on oil very thin, then it's going to be much more, it could potentially be runny, or you'd have to blend it. To get something that has that level of transparency and yet retains its shape and a definite edge, acrylics, in my opinion, do that better. So that's why I always say that I think it's important to not reject modeling products, maybe just because the conventional wisdom of a few people says they're not worth using as a class themselves. I think everything can bring some strength to it, and everything has some weakness. And if you learn to use those to your advantage, you're going to have more tools available at your disposal to execute what it is you're trying to do, the vision you have in your head of what you're trying to do. So, if you've not used acrylics before, or if you've not used oils or enamels, try using something outside of your comfort zone. Work with it for a while. I think one of the biggest issues that in talking with other modelers when they ask me, about the use of some of these things, is they tend to watch a video, go try it one time, and when it doesn't work exactly like shown in the video, they stop. And I really think you have to do it continually for a while. When I started working with acrylics, I'd never really used acrylic weathering products until I got into doing sci-fi. And when I started using them, I said, okay, I'm going to give myself 6 months. And on a few models, I forced myself to use nothing but acrylics. And that really gave me the opportunity to figure out, okay, if I'm going to hold to that, if I'm going to use nothing but acrylics, how can I do streaking? How can I do staining? How can I do washes? How can I make it work? And after a while, when you fully explore that, you figure out what they're good at, what they're not, and you can work them into, I guess you'd say, your repertoire of tricks in the bag that you have. So anyway, I've got the weathering done with the acrylics, and I did on his eye, when I got back home and looked at it, I wasn't real happy with it. It dried very dark. And so what I did was I went back and I repainted it to give it a little bit of a gradient towards the lower part. I put a thinner coat of that contrast paint over it. I put that one white dot there at the top of it to look like a reflection. When that fully dries, I'm going to go in and put just a dot of the contrast paint over that to give it the tint of the lens. And then you'll note that I put just a little bit of the color around the edges to try and give it some glow. And then what I'll do is when everything dries, I'm going to put a gloss coat, just a drop of gloss on that to give it some shine and see how it looks. Hopefully it'll look okay. I'm not real impressed with my work there on this, but it's growing on me. So hopefully I won't have to change that again. Now that I have the acrylics on and I'm pretty much done with the weathering, I just want to add a few more streaks and stains with oil paints, because I can refine those a little bit more and get some effects that I can't do, as I was just talking about with the acrylics. I've used them for their strengths. Now I'm going to go to some oils for their strengths. I'm using Winsor & Newton Raw Umber. This is a really good color to have in your collection of oil paints for a variety of things. It's great for washes. It's great for tinting things. It's great for filters. It's really great for oil type stains and dirt stains and things like that. It's just a very good color for that. I wish somebody would invent a screw-on lid that could pop off the top and you'd have the little tiny squeeze thing, because man, sometimes when these dry up, no matter how much you try to clean them, they're hard to get off, especially when you have arthritis like I got. Anyway, I've got the oils on my palette, and most important, checking the palette. What did I eat to get the palette? We have Spanish rice today, so love that stuff, especially when you put some sausage in it. Man, that's awesome. Anyway, I've got it on the palette here. I've got a little bit of odorless thinner in my metal palette, and what I'm going to do here is just work. I guess I've never really quite understood when people say I'm doing oil paint rendering. I've seen it demonstrated, I've heard it explained, but I keep coming back to it and just going, yeah, but you're just putting paint on the model. What makes it special? And I guess there is nothing special. I guess that's just what it is. It's just, like we call something dry brushing. Yeah, that's just putting paint on the model too, but it helps identify it. So I guess I need to quit getting hung up about the name and just realize it's just painting oil paint on to the model. But that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to get a little thinner on the brush, and I'm going to get some color on there, and I'm just going to begin working it out almost like you would on a wet palette, but this is not a wet palette, obviously. And I'm going to go to an area that I want to have the streak, and let's say I want to have one right here. I'm just going to put that, just paint that on roughly like that, and just let that sit there for a little bit. And I'm going to work around, and I'll let that dry. In fact, I see there's a dot of color right up there, and I'm going to go up there and I'm going to soak that up. So now I've just got basically an oil stain. Now that oil will remain workable for quite a while, and I'm going to give that a little bit of a time to dry. Now the temptation is to go over here and put one on this side, but instead of doing that, because obviously there's something going on there that's going to make that kind of stain, but over here I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to do it around it like that to indicate that maybe they have something going on there. But in some cases it stains, in some cases it drips, and in some cases nothing happens, because there's no need to make everything symmetrical. And then let's see, I want maybe a more dramatic leak right here, so I'm just going to put a big blob of it right there and clean my brush off a little bit and just draw that down. Well, that wasn't as dramatic as I'd hoped. That's the beauty of oils. I can go back, add a little more, draw that down. Now, again, I'll leave that to dry and come back in a few minutes and refine that. But this is the process I'm going through on the mobile suit, on the armor suit, is just looking for areas that I think might have a stain there, and then putting those on. You can do something similar. One of the things I like doing is, you remember I showed putting some thinner on here and then letting the acrylic wash or the acrylic product run through that. Well, the same process can be done with oils in pretty much the exact same way. You just paint that on there, and then you get some oil and you just touch it to it, and let that flow. And a lot of times what I'll do, because it's going to dry in a slightly different way, I'll just let that sit just like it is. And you can come back and add more oil. See how that just... And the opacity of the oil is not so great, but because I put that over something that I'd already stained, then it's giving it a darker look. And notice the pattern that formed there. I'm going to leave that. I like that. To my eye, that looks like an oil stain. So anytime you're modeling, I do this all the time. When serendipitous things happen, when good things happen like that look cool, leave them. Don't blend them out. You know, watch for them. Or if you're not sure if you like it, especially with oils, leave it be. And then later on, you can come back and decide, do I want to keep that or do I want to do something else with it? So I'm going to continue around, and I'm just going to be adding in these stains and streaking them. And I'll come back in just a moment when these have had a little more time to dry and show you how to refine that. All right, I've gone around and I've added all the stains that I want to. So let me come in here. This had just a few minutes to dry. And in real time, this has probably had about 15 minutes to dry. So it's not a great deal of time, but I'm going to use the same brush to refine it. Now, you can use a clean brush. As you can see, though, I've fairly well cleaned this one. Yeah, it's leaving a little bit of color, but not too much. I'm not too worried about that. But all I do is I come in and I start away from the edge, and I just start pulling down, and then I slowly work my way into it until I hit the edge of it, and I blend it however I want. And then I just flip it over, and I do the same thing from the other side. And then at that point, it's just a matter of how thin or how thick do you want to leave it. And that's how thin I want it. And you'll note that it leaves just a little bit of a tint on either side of it, which is good. And just kind of made that streak very much more refined than it was. You can't do that with acrylics. That's why I like oils for this. And then like this one up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same kind of process, and I'm going to start blending it down like that, and that's going to pull it down some, and I'm fine with that. We can get a little more thinner on my brush, clean that off just a bit. But just keep refining that like that. And then what I can do, because I'm happy with how that streak is right there, and then what I can do, if it goes down further than I want, I can come back from the bottom and literally push the oils back up like that. And so that I end up with a streak that's exactly as long as I want. And if I decide I don't like it, I could just take the brush literally and just wipe that away and start over. So the oils give a lot of flexibility in terms of your ability to move them around, to make them thinner, to make them thicker, to completely remove them if you want. And that's why I think they're worth having in your arsenal. If you're a total acrylic guy and you've never used oils, I would suggest giving oils a try, because they give you some flexibility that you don't have with acrylics. So let me go around and refine all of the other oil dots that I put on the model, and it's just about time to finish this guy up. All right, after a little off-camera gluing work, I think it's time to declare the Ghostkeel done. I have really enjoyed this model, and I definitely need to once again thank patron Chris Bernique for sending this to me. Thank you so much, Chris. I have had great fun with it. It's met my expectations and more in terms of just how much fun I was going to have with it. This is one, as I said early on, that I've wanted to build for a long time, and to now have the opportunity to do so has just really been a privilege. But I'm very happy with how it turned out. I'm happy with, now that I've got the gloss on it, I'm happy with the way his eye turned out. It's not too glowy. I didn't want to make it super bright. I wanted it to be kind of a dark, brooding kind of glow to it, and I think I got that. I like the weathering. I'm glad I did not over chip it. I don't feel like there's too much chipping on the model. There's enough that it shows wear, but that's not the feature of the weathering, but rather I think it's got a balanced look to it. So yeah, I'm real happy with the result of this and how it looks, and the fun I had with it. This is not a cheap model by any stretch. I understand, and it's why I had not been able to get one for myself. It's not a cheap model by any stretch, but it is definitely a unique looking model that is fun to build. And if you really want to build one, when you get one of these, I think you will find it to be worth the expense. So it's definitely a great model. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, and more importantly, thank you for being a supporter. This is a Patreon exclusive video series, and if you're watching this, that means that you are an enthusiast or fanatic level supporter, and I am so very grateful, both me and my family, because I know that's not a small commitment. That's really supporting the work in a big way that I do, and I am thankful for it, because it allows me to do this, to get new equipment, to get new materials, and to keep going in a way that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So I'm so very thankful for your support, and I hope you've enjoyed this series on building this Ghostkeel Battlesuit, because like I've said, it is a lot of fun, and it's a really cool look, and it's well worth the time to build. Well, as I always do, I'll leave you with one final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.